Joined by Christopher Brannigan, who's Senior Fellow at the Policy Exchange and former Senior Advisor to Boris Johnson, and my LBC colleague Matt Frei, who, of course, you catch Saturday mornings from 10 on LBC. Matt, I'm going to let you take the lead with this, as you've been covering the conflict in the Middle East since October. You've not long been back, so over to you to get the ball rolling.
Well, I think, the big question today, as as in the Christmas period, is, what is the international community, especially America, doing about reining in Israel? Now, no one, I think who's sensible questions the right of Israel to defend itself, but people do question to what extent Israel has the right to break international humanitarian law. And I think if you look at America, for weeks now, I've been sensing a real feeling of panic in the administration that they've given Israel too much of a green light and that the Israelis have not done what they said they would do in terms of trying to limit civilian casualties in Gaza. And whatever right they had at the beginning, whatever sympathy there was on the international stage for them to defend themselves, whatever sympathy we feel for the annihilation of Hamas is flipping to some extent, and people are wondering whether this has not created a bigger conflict, has made Israel less secure in the future, and ultimately, we'll have a political price to pay for Biden in the US election coming up, possibly here as well. People are jockeying, to find a new position and hoping that the Israelis will finally listen. I wonder, what do you think, Chris?
Well, I think that's right, Matt. That within that context, one of the key pieces that Israel has always borne in mind of what it does operationally as well as strategically is look to see whatever support comes from the United States as a determinant of what it's going to be able to do in the future. And I think some of that stems from the fact that Israel's responding to an attack and has from the outset had 5 broad objectives in mind, one of which is stop the conflict from escalating, particularly to its north with Hezbollah, looking at where other proxies may be brought into play. And you can see where those threads are starting to lead towards. So we've seen last week, the activity from the Houthis in Yemen. We've seen those drone attacks of shipping, coming up the Red Sea around that global checkpoint. And there'll be a trade-off, I think, here.
There are the suggestions, aren't there, that the US has said, you've got until the first week of January. That's your view of that.
Well, they've been trying to put a time limit on this for some time now. I mean, Blinken first mentioned that, I think, 5 or 6 weeks ago. And they're not sticking to the timetable. And in fact, the advice that America gave Israel, that Biden himself gave Israel when he visited in that first week after October the 7th, which is very wise advice. And it was couched as a question rather than an order. Of course, America knows it can't really order Israel to do anything. But it said, do you think it's wise, more or less, to commit the same mistakes in the heat of blind rage and revenge that we committed after 9/11. Yeah. And everyone kind of nodded and said, yeah, no, a good idea, we won't do that. And that's exactly what they've done. So, as Chris mentioned, the extraordinary progress that had been made between, Israel and the Gulf states in the Abraham Accords, Israel and Saudi Arabia nudging towards some kind of peace accord, Israel and the rest of the Middle East, apart from Iran and, of course, Hamas and Hezbollah, was in a pretty good state. All that is in danger of being shredded by the overreaction in Gaza. And that is something that America will have to clean up, that we will feel the repercussions of, that will not make Israel safer at the end of the day.
Chris, let's get you on the idea of a timeline.
Well, I think what's been really interesting on this, Nick, is that, there has been a view here of how previous Israeli military actions taken place, very short, very deliberate, very destructive. And even within Israel, and this is an internal political issue for them, how that war is starting to pan out. This is inevitably and already a longer, slower war. You can hear commentary in Israel that says this is going to be at least a year in the process. It may be 5 years. Naftali Bennett, who's quite a well-thought-of commentator in Israeli political circles at the weekend, suggested this might be a 5-year war that sort of takes place. And so to meet these challenging pieces, when you start a war, everybody thinks it's on a schedule. Look how history corrects all of that. I mean, how you then meet on a timetable is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And as Matt says, if Blinken's come in to say you've got to have this done and by the first week of January, you may have achieved some of those objectives, but a bigger thing will still play out. I think this is going to be a longer, slower war than it has been.
I don't think it's going to be 5 years, but I think it will be months and possibly even a year. Who knows? I think the timetable is actually slightly less important than the ultimate objectives. And this is where we're somewhat puzzled because, what is the objective of Israel? If the objective is to destroy Hamas, does that require the wholesale destruction of Palestinian society in the Gaza Strip? And I'm not just talking about civilian casualties here, which they say they're trying to limit, but they're not doing a great job, let's be honest. I'm also talking about the destruction of schools, of hospitals, of mosques and churches. I mean, they say, well, we're destroying everything that's got a Hamas tunnel under it, but that's all of it, because the Gaza Metro basically extends through the entire territory. And then when you've got almost 2 million people displaced, and you push them into this place called the Al-Mawasi enclave, which is an area the size of Heathrow Airport, right, with nothing in it. It's a rubbish dump and a bit of sand with no infrastructure whatsoever, no plumbing, no electricity. There's nothing there. What's the ultimate idea? Is the ultimate idea that you're going to push them eventually into Egypt, but the Egyptians have closed that gate and the Americans don't want that to happen because that would be saying yes to ethnic cleansing? Is the ultimate idea that you just let them starve? Well, that's yet another humanitarian catastrophe. What's the big idea, Mr. Netanyahu? And he hasn't really answered that question.
Gentlemen, we're more than halfway through our conversation and we've not even mentioned Ukraine. Chris, is this a forgotten war?
I think it's on the back burner, Nick. There's no two ways about it. I think that the introduction of so many factors in the Ukrainian conflict have now become frozen. As the Russians would always say, General Winter has appeared on the scene, and things are at stake tactically, operationally, and perhaps strategically. Things are in a very frozen state. There's no move on the ground. The Ukrainian offensive has petered out. The Russians are not doing anything tactically. They're increasing airstrikes and drone strikes and missile strikes. But more importantly behind that, I think what's really been frozen are the resource decisions for funding what's going on within that conflict. And that is exacerbating the scenario there. It is, I think, essentially diminishing Ukraine's gains and in the longer term, furthering Russia's objectives.
Matt,
and until it becomes unfrozen, it comes back on.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah, Matt, you've reported, and there are a number of occasions you'll have some contacts who are over there. What are they saying?
Well, I spent 4 months in Ukraine last year, and I got to know people, in government there quite well. And when I was in Israel covering that war, I got panic calls from them saying, "When are you coming over? Why aren't you here? What about us?" Yeah. With all sorts of offers that we've not had before about access to various things. They are panicking that this, as Chris has said, might become a forgotten war. And so, we saw, imagine this, Zelensky, who was, appeared at Glastonbury. There was no literary festival in this country with a big video screen that didn't have President Zelensky beamed into it. He was the toast of the geopolitical dinner party. And there he was last week with a begging bowl going from Brussels, to New York, to Washington saying, please give us our funding. And what happened? In New York, or rather in Washington, the Republicans blocked it. The Republicans, the party of American power projection, blocked it because they thought, money's better spent at home. In America, supporting Ukraine is now not a vote winner. It is, if anything, by a slight margin, a vote loser. And the Republicans have cottoned on to that, as indeed has Trump. In Brussels, yes, but in a surprise move, Viktor Orban, the spanner, in the EU side, was prevailed upon by Olaf Scholz of Germany to leave the room as they were discussing accelerated accession talks for Ukraine, to have a very long cup of latte. And then when he came back, lo and behold, the 26 of them said, right, unanimously, we agree that Ukraine can start these talks to join the EU, which is a massive victory for them. But 2 hours later, Orban turned around and said, you know what? There's 50 billion euros they need in order to survive for the next year. I'm going to veto that. So Ukraine and the issue of Ukraine, through the kind of vehicle of Viktor Orban, has created a massive headache for the European Union.
Do you think, Chris, Rishi Sunak is as close to Ukraine and the Ukrainian plight as, say, Boris Johnson was?
I think Johnson's behaviour on the Ukrainian stage is exceptional. I think that was a man at the moment, with a degree of momentum behind him that generated all that, and that will be very difficult to replace. It would be comparable to Zelensky being replaced by someone internal in Ukraine. It's never going to be quite the same. I don't think the United Kingdom as a whole is any further distant from what goes on within Ukraine. I think that remains exactly the same, and our position's been consistent. But I do think, as Matt's alluded to, much of what really opens up the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine is what goes on within the European Union rather than what goes on within the United Kingdom. I think we can lead But the money to be able to resolve this lies with the freeing of that 50 billion euros, as Matt alluded to.
Lastly, Matt, you can only spend £1 once. Are more pounds going to go to the Middle East than are going to go to Ukraine? What's going to happen?
Well, I think American dollars are certainly going to the Middle East in huge numbers. I think the funding ultimately for Ukraine will continue. But just on that point that Chris made, I was in Kiev and I was offered, and my God, was that a great day for me. I was offered a Boris Johnson dessert, which is a sort of great big fluffy number with lots of yellow cream on top, right? I've not been offered a Rishi Sunak canapé yet.
Sunak sorbet.
A Sunak sorbet has not been offered to me. I mean, Boris Johnson did, in a sense, that was his finest hour, right? He did give the Ukrainians, at a crucial point, when we all thought they would be rumbled by Russian tanks, that emotional and then ultimately military support. Now imagine just for 1 second, Nick Ferrari, what Boris Johnson could do if he was still in the European Union. But if he was in there and he was saying to the French and the Germans, that man Orban, he's got to go.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Christopher.